Today, 1 Samuel chapter 18. It's a passage that flows or comes right off the heels of one of the most famous Bible stories in all of Scripture, the recounting of David and Goliath. It's perhaps the classic underdog story. We took note of how we have been misguided in our understanding of that story, that we're not meant to see ourselves as David. We're not meant to be the ones that go out and slay the giant and win the day. But rather, we are to see Christ in all of his glory and going to the cross to fight the giants of sin and death, and come out victoriously through his resurrection. And through that resurrection, we're free from the oppression of sin and death, and can rather go on the offensive and live in hope and victory within our lives. But when we turn the page over to chapter 18, we find the events that happen immediately after that epic battle between David and Goliath. King Saul and his son Jonathan and all of Israel are faced with a question in light of this. And the question is that though David can seemingly be trusted with their battles and fighting Goliath and fighting on their behalf, well, what do they think about him as a person? Are they afraid of him? Do they hate him? Do they love him? And this text is meant for us to fix our eyes onto the true King, Jesus, and ask the same questions. We may trust that Jesus defeated sin and death on the cross, and that he is totally good to fight on our behalf. But how do we feel about him? Are we afraid of him? Do we like him? Do we love him? Do we give him the rightful place in our hearts and in our minds? Does he stand alone in our affections, or is he just one thing among many in our lives that we are somewhat devoted to? You know, I love chocolate chip cookie dough ice cream. I also love Rocky Road. I like a lot of different kinds of ice cream. There are some that I don't like. I love pizza, and I love burritos. I love classical music. If you came into my office during the week and wanted to talk to me, more than likely, 90% of the time, I'm going to push pause on whatever classical piece I'm listening to at the moment. But, you know, there are times in which you might catch me listening to 90s pop. NSYNC might come on every so often, and I say that to my shame, but that's okay. There's nothing inappropriate about that. There's nothing incongruent about loving two kinds of ice cream, loving two different kinds of food, or having more or multiple genres of music that we love and adore. That's normal, that's expected. But what if I were to tell you that I was in love with my wife as well as another woman? Well, immediately, some red flags would begin coming up in your mind. The board this next week, if that were true, would probably be asking for my resignation. Why? Because regardless of what the culture might tell us, it's morally wrong to love two people at the same time in the same way. And in the same way, if we trust Jesus' work and his life and death and resurrection, and it's sufficient for cleansing us of our sins, for removing the wrath of God from upon us and giving us the newness of life. But he also demands that we love him with all of our soul, with all of our mind, with all of our strength. He demands that he be first in our hearts and that there be no competition of affection. That's easier said than done, and this text today exposes how we have a propensity to love ourselves, our status, our image, our priorities, our desires, our entire lives and beings more than Christ. This text explores the danger of being in that state, but it also provides the remedy for how we get out of that. So let's read the text together, and then we'll dig in 1 Samuel chapter 18, starting in verse 1. As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, and his armor and even his sword and his bow and his belt. And David went out and was successful in whatever Saul sent him to do, so that Saul set him over the men of war. And this was good in all the sight of the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. And as they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines and songs of joy and with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated, Saul has struck down his thousands and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very angry at this saying, and it displeased him. He said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they've only ascribed thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day on. The next day, a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre. And as he did day by day, Saul had his spear in his hand, and Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David evaded him twice. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. So Saul removed him from his presence and made him a commander of 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. And David had success in all of his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. And when Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in fearful awe of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before him. Before them, I should say. Well, if we want to have correct affections in our lives, the first thing that we have to do is love the Lord our God. We have to love the Lord our God. Verses 1 through 5 serve as a summary of the rest of the chapter. Remember, David has just come off of the defeat of Goliath. The end of chapter 17 records that Abner had taken David and brought him from the valley of Elah with the head of Goliath in his hands and everything to King Saul. And David introduced himself to Saul. And now in verse 1, it says that as soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. So it would do us really good for just a moment to push pause and take a look at this relationship between Jonathan and David. There are many in our culture that have looked at this description and seen with the way that it's worded, and they've concluded that Jonathan and David were perhaps in a homosexual relationship together, and that this is evidence coming straight from the Bible that the Bible and hence God endorses same-sex relationships. Well, with that, what that view says is that it says more about our twisted culture than it does with the historical and linguistic realities of what is happening here in the text. The language that the author uses here is not sexual in any regards. When he writes that the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, it was much more of a tight familial friendship that was bonded together. And I hope you have had a friendship with someone of the same sex where you're so close that you're like brothers, or you're like sisters. Man, you have a platonic friendship that, man, you do anything for this person. You die for this person. You can share anything with this person, and there's no fear that what you tell them is going to go anything beyond the conversation that you have. We could all use a friendship like that of Jonathan and David. And if you look at these words and conclude that they had a gay relationship, that probably says more about you and your influence, how the influence of modern culture has affected you than what was actually happening. So in verse 4, it's where we see Jonathan's love for David and his admiration of what it actually looks like. Notice that it says that Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow and his belt. And the significance of this can't be stressed enough. Jonathan was more than likely close to 30 years older than David. David is just a teenager here. Jonathan's well into his 40s. David's a simple shepherd musician from some podunk town where he's a shepherd. Jonathan is the crown prince, heir to the throne of Israel. And yet, when Jonathan witnessed the victory that David had over Goliath, he willingly abdicated everything that he had and gave it to him who he saw as the one who should be on the throne. His robe was like his crown. That when he walked around, people would see from all over town that this man is the crown prince. He is the one that is heir to the throne. And notice that there's no hesitancy. There's no reluctance. There's no hint of trepidation. Jonathan recognizes, even in his regal position, the one who is greater than he is before him. In giving him his armor, his sword, his belt, his bow, he is submitting himself to David's protection. Remember, because the Philistines had controlled the metal market and hence the blacksmithing industry, the only people that had weapons in all of Israel were King Saul and his son. And so in his love and his respect and his honor of David as a person and as a victorious warrior, Jonathan is willingly saying to him, take your place on the throne. Take everything that I am. You can take everything that is important to me. I have submitted everything to you. Everything that's precious, my protection, my family line, my future, everything I trust in is yours. It's a symbolic act of what every Christian needs to do before Christ. When we look upon his perfect life, when we gaze upon his substitutionary death, and when we gaze upon his victory and his resurrection, the proper response is not only to trust in that victory, but to love him. So much so that our love for him takes precedence over all earthly comforts. It is to love him so much that he trumps everything that we hold dear. Our marriages, our families, our jobs, our home, our security, our bank accounts, our safety, even our very lives are to come as a distant second to the love that we are to have for Christ. To truly come to Christ is not just to believe, but to behold and to love above all things. I know, as someone who's been pastoring for about 15 years, I've learned something about the human heart. I've learned it through observation in people that I talk with, and I've learned the hard way of looking into my own heart. And my fear is that verse 5 is more of an indictment on us than we want to realize. It says, and David went out, was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war, and this was good in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. Notice in that last phrase that this is good in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants, but whose name is not put in there for their love of David? Saul's. It does not say anything about King Saul's affection. Saul doesn't love David the way everybody else does. And instead, Saul sees David as a threat. He's a threat to the throne. He's a threat to his reputation. He is a threat to everything that Saul holds dear, namely his image that he wants to project and protect. And my fear is that as much as we'd like to be like Jonathan, in practice we're more like Saul. And that leads us right into our second point, is that we need to evaluate where our true love lies. We should evaluate where our true love lies. You and I are living in one of two different kingdoms. Either we are living under the kingship of Christ, in which we have and continue to take off our robes of righteousness and hand them over to the true King and submissive recognition, or we are living in the kingdom of the self, where we sit on the throne and we dictate the rules and we dictate what does and doesn't apply to us. And we desire that everyone else take off their robes and hand it to us. And here's the tricky thing, that even as believers, we can still be committed to the self and that kingdom and not even realize it. It can come when everything looks good in our lives. But more so, it comes when there's a threat to our kingdom, that we see how entangled we are. For some of us, our kingdoms are very, very fragile. It doesn't take much. It takes an inconvenience. It might take a little jab from someone, or where we're incensed, we're triggered, we're offended. For others, it might take a major life event to realize what kingdom we are part of. But the kingdom you're living under will in some way show up when you least expect it. From the vantage point of verses 1 through 5, everything seems great. Everyone was happy. Saul wanted David around. But it didn't take much, did it, to fracture Saul's fragile ego. It took a simple victory parade. Look in verse 6. As they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tambourines and songs of joy and with musical instruments. Now, that certainly didn't seem to be the problem, does it? They're partying in the streets, and rightfully so. Because Goliath is gone, the Israelites don't have to worry about being slaves of the Philistines. And the text does say that they came out to meet King Saul. The problem was when Saul heard the songs that were being sung. Look at verse 7. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated. Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Now, I don't think that the women here were intentionally trying to offend or trying to put down Saul and elevate David. They're simply using a Hebrew structure of poetry called parallelism. Granted, it's sort of a weird way to use it, but there's no hint of them trying to be rude here. But in Saul's mind, David had ascended now to the throne of the hearts of the people. Look at verses 8 through 9. Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. He said, "They've ascribed to David 10,000s, and they've ascribed to me thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom?" And Saul eyed David from that day on. Keep in mind that this is only like a couple of hours after Goliath had died. So a good indication that you are living in the kingdom of self is you get angry when others get glory. You get angry when others get elevated. You have this need to get recognition. You have this public persona that you want to display. And when the minute that is threatened or upstaged, you get angry or jealous or sad or fearful, or perhaps a complex mixture between any one or two of those things. It doesn't have to be in some big grandiose behavior. It can show itself in little jabs, or perhaps gossiping about someone, or little snickers here and there, or maybe whining and complaining. Maybe there's some subtle malice that's involved. Maybe there's some manipulation that's involved. Every one of us is different, but if we are loving ourselves above all and living under the kingdom of self, offense will be taken and swift action will be employed. For Saul, the threat to his ego and his crown resulted in murderous intent. Look in verses 10 through 11. The next day, a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre, as he did day by day. Saul had his spear in his hand, and Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David evaded him twice. So it seems like not even a day had gone by. They hadn't even gotten settled in. That this harmful spirit that we saw back in chapter 16 that came upon Saul when the Spirit of God left Saul, the evil or the harmful spirit came upon him. And if you remember that, you can go. If you don't, you can go back to our sermons and see what that all meant. But the chronology of these chapters is a bit challenging, but remember that when this injurious spirit came upon Saul, David was called into the court in order to be a music therapist of sorts. He played the lyre, which is sort of like a mini harp, and music would soothe the savage beast, and Saul would be back to normal. But not on this particular occasion. Saul wasn't interested in music therapy here, because in his mind, the very one who is here to soothe his soul is the one who is actually rotting it. And obviously we're third-party observers here. And we can plainly see that the problem is not with David. The problem, there's nothing wrong with David. David isn't trying to usurp the throne. He's not trying to take his job. He's not trying to attempt a coup. He's just doing what he was called to do, minding his own business, and then being threatened for it. The situation isn't the problem. Saul is completely secure on the throne. There's no threat here. However, the problem is with Saul. Saul does not understand that he is responsible and he alone for his feelings. He is responsible and him alone for his actions and what comes because of his feelings. He is blinded to his sinful heart. There's nothing wrong with David or the situation, yet Saul wants to place all of his problems and all of his mental discomfort on David. There's no doubt that Saul is under his own kingship and not God's. And if you and I are living under our own personal kingdoms with the love of self, one of the chief ways that will come out is by deflecting and blaming. If we're loving ourselves above all, then we could never be the problem. Nothing is our fault. We're the victims. We're not the criminals. We have a heart of gold, and everyone else is out to get us. We will convince ourselves that we are right, and we will do whatever we can to excuse or justify, point the finger, or lessen the offense. We will become our own personal defense lawyers that have no problem lying and cheating in order for us to come out on top. And Saul's problem is our problem. We don't understand the depths of the wickedness of our hearts. And when we fall prey to our own self-love, our own self-justification, and our own self-righteousness, we will do whatever we can to remove those feelings or the perceived threat. Look in verses 12 through 13. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. So Saul removed him from his presence and made him a commander of 1,000. So the reason that Saul sent David out, essentially, is because of fear. Fearing his position, his popularity, fear of being upstaged, fear of the loss of his image, fear of the loss of his authority. Fear is a powerful motivator that will lead us to do things that we otherwise would never have thought we would have done. And notice here that it's not as if Saul just sent David home. He sent him to the front lines of battle. It's the same exact plot that David would do later on in his life in response to his own sin with Bathsheba when he sent Uriah the Hittite out to the front lines of battle so that he would be killed in battle and that David would be just perfectly clean from it. And as a commander, he's certainly not going to sit behind everyone. He'd be up front and leading the charge. So make no mistake, Saul sent David out here with the hopes that he would be eliminated in war. But friends, my guess is none of us here, hopefully, are going to hire a hitman to take care of our problems. But you may try to bury them or eliminate them as much as possible. When you live in the love of the self, the kingdom of self, you'll do whatever it takes to keep that image up. Whether that means maybe clearing out the cache or the history of your computer, paying someone off, perhaps making the exaggeration become a bigger and bigger lie the more that you tell it. Maybe it's digging your heels into the ground, getting rid of the evidence, cutting off a relationship. The sky's the limit when it comes to what we will do in the creative ways that we will try to keep us enthroned on the kingdom of our hearts. And a fundamental commitment to yourself, however, will inevitably collide at some point with the kingdom of Christ. They will collide. God will continue to send reminders to you that you are not in charge and that your love is misdirected. Look in verse 13. And he, being David, went out and came in before the people, and David had success in all of his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. Saul reacted to David's victory in the worst way possible, and it ended up backfiring on him in the worst way possible for him. Whereas his intention was to have David slaughtered on the battlefield, God used it as a means to increase David's popularity and his power. Don't be surprised when you try to assert your perceived self-sovereignty that God will counter with reminders of his sovereignty. It seems as if at this point in Saul's mind, he's sort of taken aback because everything he has tried is not working. Look in verses 15 through 16. When Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in fearful awe of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before them. And Saul had good reason to be in fearful awe. If you remember way back in chapter 8, when the Israelites were coming to Samuel and saying, we need a king. This whole judges system, this isn't working anymore. We need a king that's like all the other nations. And if you remember, one of the primary reasons why they asked for a king was so that he would go out in battle for them and win battles on their behalf. And so this term in verse 16 where it says that he went out and came back in, that's a military term. Saul's paranoia that David would usurp the throne he actually sends David out to do what he himself is supposed to do. David isn't supposed to fight these battles. This is supposed to be Saul. And no wonder all of Israel and Judah loved David. He is everything that they asked for years ago. He is becoming in everyone's mind what a king looks like. And you can try your very best. But every time that you send your ego out to do battle against Christ's kingdom, Christ's kingdom is going to win every single time. He might make you think you're winning the battle or that the war is almost over, but he will get the victory. God's not afraid to war with you in this, because his battle plan is not to send you out into destruction, but to get you to a place where you throw down your weapons, you raise the white flag and realize that the one that you are battling, the one that you think is your enemy, is the one that you actually need on your throne. And that leads us to our brief and final point, is that we should redirect our love. We need to redirect our love. I can't make myself love certain things. I can't control that I like certain foods and dislike others. I love my wife and I love my kids, and I've never had to work at that. It's just what it is. It's just there. So how can someone go from loving themselves above all things to giving themselves up completely and loving Christ above all things? How can we move from the heart of loving ourselves to loving the Lord our God with all of our hearts, minds, souls, and strength? We've seen in this account that everything changed when Goliath hit the ground. But before that stone was slung, to everyone else, David was just a teenager. Teenager with a lot of confidence. But once the thud fell in the valley and the sound reverberated throughout both of the camps of the army, victory was realized and a grateful love was brought onto David by the people that he had won the victory for. And so it is with Christ. If we want our affections to change, we first have to admit that by our own will, we love ourselves above all. And we cannot defeat it in ourselves. And once we grasp how sinfully we love ourselves and how unable we are to look not in a valley, but to a hill where the true King, Jesus, was crucified. We're to look to an empty tomb where he walked out in victory after 3 days of being dead. We are to look to his ascension where he now sits at the right hand of God on high and has authority over everything. And when we take off our robes of righteousness, the symbols of our personal kingdoms, and we give them to the true King, we then give him our weapons. We give him our armor. We give him our security. We give him our hopes. We give him our insecurities. We give him our desires. We give him our entire lives, and we do it willingly and joyfully without hesitation, saying, "Take it, Lord. You are the true King. It's yours. Everything that I have and everything that I could be is yours. I give you the throne of my heart, and I ask that you would conquer any rebel threat that would come against you. And as you do, day by day, die to yourself by stepping off the throne and handing over your robe and yielding your desires and your wills over to him. You will see his goodness. You will taste of his mercy. You will love his grace. You'll fall in love with him little by little, day by day, more and more, because, friends, you cannot live in two kingdoms. You can't have two loves. Only Christ is worthy of our full affection. And where that leaves you is to figure out whether you're going to be like Saul, keeping a death grip on the love of yourself and your own little kingdom that will eventually come crumbling down. Or, if you'll be like Jonathan, giving up his future, his reputation, his glory, his safety, his very being, so that the true king can take his place. Let's pray.